Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Mark Graben, and we're joined today by our guest, Craig Gygi. He is, among other things, co-author of the book Six Sigma for Dummies. Craig, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you here on the podcast. You are the second of the For Dummies series authors to be here on the podcast. Episode 145 was Natalie Sayer. She was co-author of Lean for Dummies. There's some connections or overlap before you introduce yourself.
The co-author with Natalie on Lean for Dummies is Bruce Williams, and he also joined me on writing Six Sigma for Dummies and the Six Sigma Workbook for Dummies. So we share a co-author. And when Natalie and Bruce wrote Lean for Dummies, they asked me to do some manuscript review. You'll see my name in really small print right in the acknowledgments, but it was a fun project and a really worthwhile book.
Yeah, and we're not going to be exploring Six Sigma formally today, but before we get into that, here I should give you the floor, Craig, and let you introduce yourself and maybe tell the listeners a little bit about your career and kind of the arc that's taken.
Yeah, it has been an arc. Six Sigma and Lean and operations were not things I grew up thinking I was going to get into.
What did you want to do then? Sorry,
an astronaut, or a professional baseball player. But I started off my career as an engineer. I was designing cell phone products for Motorola. And this happened to be the time where they were rolling their Six Sigma initiative out to their full supply chain and then even out to third parties. And so a lot of that resonated very deeply with me, just probably with the style I approach work and the things I had learned in my graduate studies. But I started to use that quite extensively in my next jobs, helping companies design products that would be high quality right out of the chute. I even started a software company that provided tools for engineers and designers so that they could design products. If you've heard of tolerance stacking, that was the product. It was a good product, and a lot of people even use it today. But over the years, I started to get into operations. I saw that as a point of greater leverage than product design. Mm-hmm. And I've come to find that operations is a place where the work and the decisions of a company happen, where the reality of the company is formed. And so over the years, I've gone into a lot of operations. Now, along the way, I have done a lot of Lean Six Sigma training. I was one of those that, stood up for 4 weeks at a time and presented PowerPoint slides. And if you asked me right now, I probably could start doing my presentation by memory and teach you how to be a Six Sigma black belt. And about a month from now, we'd be done with the instruction. But those days are behind us. The Six Sigma for Dummies book has helped with that, make it more of a commodity and more leaned out type of training. And then also along the way, I've had a chance to work with a lot of Japanese suppliers. I came into Lean through Six Sigma, but I greatly appreciate the philosophy and probably the better platform that Lean provides. And so today what I do is I consult with companies. I sometimes take full-time positions, but I help their leadership and their ownership understand the inescapable role that operations plays and how to form those in a way that leads to greater productivity and greater value for customers. Now, I didn't say the word lean because I sometimes try to avoid that. When you say lean or when you say Kaizen, most people have heard of it and they have an idea in their mind. And so I try to get past those preconceived notions, right, and talk about really what they need to do. And so that's where I'm at today. And one of the things that goes along with that is data. I see a great need for talking about how to look at data, how to use data. Data is just becoming pervasive in the world today. But in spite of that, there's growing problems with how data is used. And so, I've seen your most recent book, Measures of Success, and I see it doing taking people down the same path that I'm trying to do with some of my efforts as well.
Yeah. And thanks for mentioning that. And we'll talk more about SPC and some of the ways that you're helping spread the word about that and teach people. But I was wondering, can you comment on how and why data is. I mean, for one, I guess it's a part of every organization, but why the connections between data and leadership are so important, even if an organization is not formally using Six Sigma as a methodology.
Well, data is everywhere. I mean, it's kind of like cameras. With cameras and smartphone cameras, every person on the planet nearly has a camera in their hands. And in today's business world, data is everywhere. And so leaders and managers, we've always said, we have to have data-based decisions and data driving our actions. And that people know that, and it makes sense. And especially leaders are now trying to take advantage of the data, the abundance of data that they have. But what I'm seeing is that they're using it in a way that probably diminishes their leadership, and in some cases can even harm or be dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we look at even what's going on with the flood of data related to the coronavirus, COVID-19 cases. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I hear people talk about this within Lean. Also, the desire to be data-driven, to have data-driven decision-making. But what do you do when you have bad data, unreliable data, or I think an issue important to each of us is bad analysis of that data. That's a real challenge and a struggle, right?
All of those, yeah. And anyone, whether they're in Six Sigma or any other field, if you've worked with data, you know that all data have noise. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, whether that's the measurement system, as we can see with the coronavirus data, there's some measurement system noise in there.
Right.
But data always has some uncertainty around it, or the situation, the context always has some uncertainty around it. And what I'm seeing is that the approaches that we've learned through traditional schooling and through MBA programs and through just from watching other people do work, the traditional ways of approaching data analysis more often than not lead us to invalid conclusions, which is the harmful part.
Right. Right. When you talk about that noise in the data, some harm comes from overreacting to said noise, like making important business decisions of some type based on a relatively meaningless fluctuation in some sort of metric. Right?
Yeah. Can I offer an example?
Yeah.
And I think everybody will feel for this. And I use this example a lot when I talk to people because everybody can understand this data that I'm going to present. Imagine you had a coin, you take it out of your pocket and you flip it 10 times in a row. How many heads do you think you'll get, Mark?
On average, 5.
Okay.
Right.
Well, that's true. Now, what if you got 7 heads? What would you do? What would your reaction be?
I mean, my reaction would be, well, I mean, that happens.
Yes.
I wouldn't accuse you of having a loaded coin.
Right. But what if that was your job, and I came to you and I said, hey, Mark, what happened? You need to go and figure out what happened. Why did you get 7? Right. And so that's an example of what management often does. There's a level of noise in that coin flipping data, and everybody has a feel for it. If you get 4, 5, or 6, even 7 heads, it's just normal. But if you got 9 heads, you might start to go, okay, wait a second, something significant. There's a signal. And so that fundamentally, that difference between noise and signal, yep. And both look the same in data. That's maybe the wrong way to say it, but without the right approaches, noise can be confused with signal. And there's proven ways over and over again that when you act on noise, thinking that it's a signal, you end up worsening the problem. And that's what I find there's this huge incentive and this cultural norm of, hey, I have to provide a solution. I have to do something. And so people look in the data for something, and because they have to do something. And like you said, in a lot of cases, how do you deal with that uncertainty?
Right. Or when you say they have to do something, they feel like they need to do something.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
They're looking for or demanding explanation of a root cause that is literally not there, right? So answering your question of what did you do differently when you flipped the coin and you got 7 heads? The honest answer is I did nothing.
Right.
In an organization that's driven by fear, I might blame somebody else. I might make up something that sounds plausible. Don Wheeler, uses the phrase writing fiction. We don't want to ask people in organizations to be writing fiction to explain something that isn't really true cause and effect analysis or even reasonable.
You're right, but that's exactly right, and that's what normally happens. I mean, when you have a situation like that, you have 3 choices. You can try to distort the system, which you've just talked about, writing fiction, or you distort the data,
right,
being a little different, or you turn and you try to say, okay, we got to figure out how to improve the system. Here's another piece of contemporary knowledge that backs this point up. I forget what the exact number is, but there is a field called meta research, where John Ioannidis and others at Stanford are studying scientific studies. They're studying studies,
right.
And they found that 80 to 90% of published research claims are unreplicatable.
Yes, I've heard this. Yeah.
So, I mean, all that shows is that the vast majority, and we're talking 80 or 90% of what people claim as fact is really 80, 90% of published science journals in every field are fiction. And that may sound provocative. That may sound over the top, but you can Google it and you can see that's the situation we're in. It literally is. It's not just the small problem where a person here or there is accidentally writing fiction. We're at a point in our use of data that 80 to 90% of published research findings are fiction.
Well, I mean, I've seen in organizations where, as you were describing, people are pressured to write fiction. They're pressured to distort the system. Where, I mean, I imagine a lot of the scientific papers, it's not intentional. Is it poor statistical analysis, or there was a phrase I wanted to ask you about, maybe pointed more towards organizations' naivete about data and drawing conclusions about data that's harmful, whether it's this realm of science that distorts what we know versus what organizations know or what leaders know. Maybe if you elaborate on that.
Yeah, I've wondered that same question. If there is such a prevalence of this problem, why? What causes it? I agree with you that it's not people maliciously trying to write fiction. That's not the case. So I think there's a few factors, and I'd love your feedback on these. But some of the things I see is, like we've talked about, this huge pressure, whether it's the organization or whether it's cultural, or whether it's just a personality trait to do something, to have an offer, to offer something in the face of this. Another one is just, if you think of the example of the research studies that I talked about, it's the whole system is incentivized where researchers have to publish research. If they don't publish research, they don't get funded. And so there's some structural socioeconomic things that reinforce that behavior. I think some of it is the ease of getting the data nowadays, right? I mean, here's the numbers. And I mean, here's a case where you can see it as well. I mean, the next time you turn on the radio and there's a news little blurb, if it's near the start of the month, they will report what the unemployment numbers were for the previous month.
Right.
And they'll say something like, last month's jobless claims were 6.2%. That's 4 points higher than the previous month, showing an increase. And you go, whoa, wait a second.
Yeah.
Is it or is it not? And so we're flooded with this incorrect way, and we can get into the details of how that example is not the right way to look at data, but it's over and over and over again. So we've been conditioned to look at data in ways that lead us to invalid conclusions. And so I think those are some of the reasons. The question that then comes to my mind is, what do we do? How do you start to get ahead of that or change that? And I've thought a lot about, I don't know, what are some of your thoughts as you're looking at this?
Well, I mean, I guess one thing I've sort of come to believe and come to say over time, you can't blame people for what they haven't been taught. Maybe to some extent that's fair. Like, at what point do you have a responsibility to go and seek out knowledge and methods? But if we look at something like statistical process control, aka control charts, aka process behavior charts, that's not taught in most educational programs or business programs. So I think a lot of it is unintentional. To borrow a phrase from a book that my dad once had on a shelf when I was a kid, there's widespread innumeracy as opposed to illiteracy.
Yes.
There was a book by John Allen Paulos, is the author there. It goes back to 1988. But I mean, there's a difference. My dad has a master's degree in statistics on top of his electrical engineering undergraduate. I've learned some statistics through engineering programs and business school, but a lot of it I've come to learn after the fact. Here's maybe a different side of it, and I want to hear your reactions. So as the people that haven't been taught statistical methods, so then they fall into the trap of the overly simplistic, looking at economic data. Well, 6.2 is higher than 5.8. What's the controversy there, Craig? Yes. They're not taught to look at the noise, the natural variation, whatever we might call it. But then there are, I think back to some of the tools that I learned in statistics classes, people in the medical profession who were taught t-tests and other types of statistical methods that Don Wheeler, as a PhD statistician, says basically, those are worth studying, but they're inappropriate and not useful in the real world. The struggle of maybe having to unlearn something. So maybe, it's one other thought before throwing it back to you, not as the defender of all things Six Sigma, not going to put you in that position, but like when I've taught process behavior charts to people who have black belts and master black belt backgrounds, part of their challenge is sort of unlearning some of the classical statistics that's been taught and used. I know I'm throwing a lot back at you in your direction, but
no, that's fine. And I've come up through similar kind of channel, similar kind of background, maybe even more so with the, graduate degree in engineering and the product design and the aerospace and computer science, all those kind of things. I agree. There has to be some unlearning. I forget, you're going to have to maybe correct me, but it was Tichi Ono or another person when they were talking about Poka-yoke. They said it's taken them 20 years to free themselves from the chains of statistics or something like that. I mean,
I don't know that quote.
I'll get it to you sometime, and I've probably butchered it, but it's along those lines. I think the start of correcting this is a very non-technical approach. Control charts, SPC, they've been around for 100 years. It's an old, mature technology, nothing new, very old compared to a lot of other approaches.
Sure.
But I think the solution lies in things that are even simpler. I jotted a few down. I think, and when I do have a course on this same topic. Same topic as your book, Measures of Success. It's a course on Pluralsight, which is a large e-learning platform. It's called Truth About Data. Mm-hmm. And throughout that course, I give some guidelines to say, okay, here's what you can do. And let me just jot a few of those down. And none of them are that technical. It's like one of them. Make sure that anytime somebody provides you data or communicates data to you, that they also communicate its context.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of depth to that statement. That on the surface, that may sound simple, but a quick way to do that, for example, is instead of just providing an average, like saying, hey, the average temperature in our city is this, it would be a time history chart, or it would be a distribution or a histogram.
Right.
All of those are much richer, much better ways of communicating data. Now, you still can provide the average.
Right.
If anybody ever gives you an average without providing you the context, like a graph that for the underlying distribution, you should immediately say, wait. So that's not very technical. I think that can be a huge advancement. Another one is anytime somebody tries to make meaning out of every single point of data, you have to say, hey, wait, time out.
Right.
Is that a signal or is that noise? And you don't have to have a control chart or SPC to even have that discussion.
A line chart goes a long way.
It does.
Yeah.
Or even just, hey, how much, the discussion, how much has this varied in the past? Is this out of the norm of that? But too often we don't stop. And then some of these require, in today's culture, and maybe it's not today's culture, in the predominant business culture, these require some bravery, some courage, because there's pressure to be different, right? There's pressure to conform to that because it's thought to be the right way. So a lot of times when I'm in business meetings, someone will put up a time history chart and they'll show the varying data, and then they'll say, and yesterday our production volume spiked. And you go, wait, that doesn't look like a spike.
Right.
It looks like just normal variation. And so I've gotten in the habit of saying, wait, let me make sure I understand you right. Because when someone says spike, that means a signal.
Right.
Something important has happened.
Something unusual.
Yeah.
There's a pause. The next step is to explain the spike. But I think this is where, like, you and I build intuition from having done formal SPC charts. We can sort of eyeball it, or you get used to knowing what that, the signal beyond the 3 sigma limits looks like.
Absolutely. And even when it's just being careful with our language and helping everybody be careful with their language to say, oh, something happened yesterday. Well, yeah, it's like flipping the coin. We got 7 heads instead of 6, but that doesn't mean anything happened. So every time there's a change in data, we can't assume, we can't jump to the conclusion that something significant or important or meaningful happened.
Yeah.
That's the reality of the world. So those are some of the simple things. I think there's some really non-technical things that could begin to shift that. Now, will we ever abandon control charts and SPC? No, not at all. What is completely flabbergasting to me, has anybody ever said that word in one of your podcasts?
Maybe not, but you certainly you've drawn me in. What's flabbergasting then?
What is that all of the prominent data tools, the ones that are most widely used, fail to include the most needed and basic tools. So for example, in Microsoft Excel or in Google Sheets, probably 2 programs that 90% of the world have access to, they don't allow you to do a control chart. They don't even allow you to create a dot plot naturally.
Right.
I mean, so there's a huge disconnect here where the most important and basic tool of looking at data is absent from the most ubiquitous tools.
I mean, the makers of the software at Microsoft could try to steer people in that direction, or there's no demand for it, or people have bought Minitab or a package that is more exclusive and more expensive.
Yeah, that's where you find those tools, and yet they're not complicated. They're not overly technical at all. They're, in fact, tools that when I sometimes go to grade schools and do little workshops, these are tools that 2nd and 3rd graders can understand and embrace in a matter of minutes.
Yeah. So let me go back and react to a couple of things I jotted down notes on. So when you talk about context, that's great. Don Wheeler writes about that in his book, Understanding Variation. Without context, data have no meaning.
Yes.
I like to use, I think this is, the idea of, imagine you're watching Sports Center and they say the score of the game was San Antonio Spurs 93. Like, what? Okay, what, did they win or did they lose? I mean, it would be one simple example of context being completely missing. The single data point or two data points. When you were talking about averages, I want to tell you a story about like one of the. I wrote a blog post about this with some collected photos. I don't know if you've seen in your travels or even around town. Hospital billboards that quote some sort of digital billboard with emergency room waiting times.
Oh yeah, it started about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I see several of them.
And it's always I'm flummoxed. Is that worse than being flabbergasted?
Probably.
I'm flummoxed by it'll say something. It'll say 30, and it'll say current average waiting time. Like, what the heck is a current average? Like, over what time frame? And like it's marketing. It's I don't know if the number even changes.
Well,
be cynical for a minute.
Following along those lines, I live near a freeway and I pass by a billboard just like that every day, and there's been a billboard that's persisted there for about 5 years. One of the regional hospitals here in where I live. And so I've had a chance to see that number, hundreds of times. So I actually know when there's a special cause going on at their hospital.
Yeah.
I can actually say, oh, whoa, it's usually, and what was interesting is I do laud them for making the data visible. And because of that, it's created some good changes. When they first put the billboard up, the numbers were 40, 30. I think that it was just a real-time feed. 40, 30, 27, 52. Those were large numbers. And now, as I go by, it's 7, 2, 12. So there's been a marked change.
Have they improved? This goes back to Brian Joyner, I think, often gets cited, talking about the three things that can happen when people are under pressure to improve. They can, as you mentioned earlier, they can distort the system, they can distort the data, or they can actually improve the system. I wonder how much of the distortion has taken place. Like, because people are creative. In England, the National Health Service was, there are notorious case studies around the government putting limits on saying, well, no patient should wait in A&E or /ER, as we would call it, accident and emergency, longer than 4 hours. And then you start seeing the distribution, and what looks like a glorious, beautiful, normal distribution bell curve suddenly gets truncated.
Yeah.
What's happening? Patients are being admitted unnecessarily because that stops the clock before it hits 4 hours, or they might get discharged inappropriately, or if they've arrived in an ambulance, they're literally kept waiting outside in the ambulance because the clock doesn't start ticking yet.
Exactly.
I'm fascinated by like these different possibilities. It could be real improvement, but maybe not.
It could be. I don't know the hospital.
Don't name them, please. But
no, I won't. But I'll say this: I've assumed that they've done some good improvement over the years, and the thought has crossed my mind: if I got in an accident, I should go to that hospital because it looks like there's been some improvement.
Yeah. But I think of like the context. There was one example I had of a billboard that showed within the same health system, the waiting times at two different hospitals. Mm-hmm. And so, that one's shorter waiting time. I should go there. It's actually further away, which if you're a local, you might know that, but like the total time from where you are.
Yeah. These are all those questions of context. And so, these are all, people are putting data out there, but is it giving valid insight? That's the question. I think there's some, I'm really glad you're writing about it. I'm hoping people take courses like what I've done, and
I'm glad you're teaching it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a leadership issue. I really do. I don't think this is something that starts with engineers and scientists. When 80 to 90% of published research findings are not replicable, not repeatable, then even science education and scientists have missed something. And so I think there's a leadership, whether it's, but I think we've seen this in a lot of companies.
But what you bring up around the researchers, and it's not a lack of intelligence, it's more like there are just holes or blind spots in our professional education, right?
Sure. Yeah, it's not ill intent. It is. There's some education holes, even for highly educated people. But I think there's also a cultural thing, and then I think there's a leadership element where those that could say, "Hey, wait, let's not. That's not. We need to wait or check something or look at this in a different way before we publish it." That's hard to do, and that's maybe what's missing is that kind of leadership.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassing myself here a little bit. The CEO of Alcoa, Paul
O'Neill.
Paul O'Neill. I
Right.
forgot his last name.
When he was, right.
That's right. He was a great example of someone who was a courageous leader.
Agreed.
I think it's that kind of leadership where you're trying to change a culture, change all these things that will have more impact than perhaps the educational technical part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to ask you some other questions about some of these in observations and insights that you have around data and organizations. But one other thing I was going to bounce off you for your reactions when you talk about methods don't have to be highly technical.
Uh-huh.
So in the realm of political polling, I think one good thing that I think can translate then to talking about noise in business metrics when there's some sort of poll. Candidate A is at 46%, candidate B is at 43%. Most of the time they report, well, there's a margin of error, plus or minus 4%.
Yep.
So plus or minus 4%, there's a 4% difference in the polling. Like, we don't know who's winning.
Right.
When it really comes down to it, right? And we can use that same idea in business going back to your example earlier, if you have two data points. Well, one is higher than the other. What's the controversy? It has to do with margins of error, if you will, or noise, right?
Yes. It does. And I think and I've noticed that as well. That's a good thing. Now, political polling is kind of in a crisis of identity right now. They haven't been good. Their results haven't their polls have not predicted what has happened in reality. The 2016 presidential election is a great example. So they're trying to figure out that. And I think it comes back to some of the basic things, sampling, representative samples, the sample sizes. It's not very technical, but it doesn't have to be technical. The larger the sample, the greater the confidence you can have in your data. And the more the sample represents the true population you're trying to analyze, the more confidence you can have in it. And so I know that the political polling industry is wrestling with some things right now because they do some things right, like you're talking about. They report margins of error and things like that, but at the end of the day, they've had a hard time having their polls track what happens on election day.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's an implicit, like it's an assumed margin of error based on an assumption that everybody who responded to us was telling us what they really thought.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the Brexit polling, there is, to take it out of our American realm. I think, there were suspicions that people didn't want to admit to the pollsters that they were in favor of leaving the EU.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, right?
Yeah, and that may be happening. And in fact, I'm sure it's happening to some degree or another in the U.S. and everywhere else too. So there's some real things to wrestle with, but most situations are fairly simple. Marketing, let's say sales data or sales volume or production numbers or quality of healthcare. Uh, those are numbers that we can track and tell. Is there something that can we make a valid analysis of those kind of data? Absolutely, we can. And the part that we're trying to fix is that it doesn't happen as often as it should.
Yeah. That what doesn't happen? I'm sorry.
Reaching a valid conclusion.
Oh.
It just looks like a conclusion and it used data, so it must be right. Well, actually, it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. I know in your course, you use different examples, if I remember right, from your online course. But you know, Dr. Demings' red bead game.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
The red and white bead experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with that one. That's a staple of us Six Sigma trainers. We know that one.
Yeah. But one point that I started making, and like, you know, after the third round, I fire the worst performing 3 out of the 6, what Dr. Deming called the willing workers in the exercise. And like going through that exercise, and finally solidified with me, and now I think I try to teach it and pass it along. That decision to fire the bottom 3 is absolutely data driven, but it's also at the same time absolutely unfair.
Right. And it probably isn't, I would call it invalid, meaning it used data, but it wasn't
Right.
It wasn't directed by correct insight from data.
Because everybody's performance is within the realm of random fluctuations.
Yeah.
So it was data driven, but they were also randomly fired. And I think that's a real, I'm still noodle on that of like, how can something be data driven but be wrong?
Right. And that is the essence of the issue that we're talking about, is that all these decisions across all these companies and organizations, in governments, in everywhere we're looking, those data decisions are being made. And yet more often than not, they're like the red bead experiment, where yes, it was based on data, but it wasn't the right valid use of analysis to get to the right result.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the example from Deming that I use, and that's probably the credit to Deming, is that he knew how to connect this with the real world. The experiment that I use often is the marble drop experiment, where you're dropping a marble through a funnel, trying to hit a target on the floor. And what that shows is, and it's a very simple experiment. I mean, but anytime you use data, like how far you missed the target, you measure how far you are, but anytime you tamper with the system, meaning you use data invalidly, it makes the system worse. So that's a great example of showing that, hey, when there's and I'm thinking this, maybe this is a fresh thought that I haven't thought all the way through, but maybe part of the cause of this data naivete is that people don't realize how harmful they're actually being. They haven't done something like the marble drop experiment and seen that when you tamper, when you intervene invalidly, you actually make things worse.
You increase variation.
Absolutely.
In the funnel experiment.
Yep. Yeah. Or in some cases, depending on how you do it, you walk the data right off the page, you get right off the target. I mean, there's any number of things that can happen. So I don't know if there's a humble, healthy respect for, I'll use a term from healthcare, for iatrogenics. There's not a healthy enough regard for, hey, I could be, and that seems so odd in a healthcare setting where, the oath is do no harm. But I think our culture is do something, and there's not a healthy enough respect for, or at least maybe there's a naivety about the damage I'll be doing by doing something. That maybe that's part of the problem.
Well, people want to say, well, yeah, what's the harm in reacting to the data point? I'm being an action-oriented leader, and what's the harm? Well, the harm is I think try to articulate it as the harm is you're wasting time. The harm is you have a faulty understanding between cause and effect.
Yes.
In your business. Those seems like they can be mildly damaging or really, really harmful.
Yeah, and in healthcare, where you have a lot of experience, I think patient safety and patient health and even patient mortality is affected by that. Mm-hmm. It's as serious as it can get. In business and manufacturing, other things, it causes a loss of profits or it causes a waste of material. But I think the Hippocratic Oath has lasted through these centuries because it is that profound and that wise. The first part should be do no harm. And I think that's the intent, but I think our data practices have got us away from that.
Yeah. So this is I'll apologize for being pedantic. I have my engineer trait of there's this detail I'm gonna bring up for discussion here, but for the words "first do no harm" don't appear in the Hippocratic Oath. There's that different. It's a related concept, but it is just a bit of a detour. But John Toussaint, who is a physician and was CEO at Theta Care and has done a lot of healthcare improvement work. I'm passing along, he points out as a physician, the Hippocratic Oath really says first and foremost, I will honor and protect those who trained me, which is an altogether, anyway, it's an altogether different point than do no harm. But
maybe I've misquoted it.
I think it just goes to show. Anyway, no, I'm not trying to pick on you for. It's a common blurring of the different medical concepts, but I think there's an analogy of protecting those who taught us business practices instead of challenging what was done by the people before us. That could be tough culturally in an organization, right? I know you saw at Motorola. At what point did Six Sigma become something that could not be questioned, or did it?
I think they were still questioned. There were still some questions in the early '90s when I was there. Mm-hmm. I've been away from Motorola long enough that I don't know what the culture is now. Okay, fair enough. But you're right. The point you're making is that kind of questioning allowed? And the best companies, the highest performing companies, and the ones that I'm sure the healthcare systems that perform the best are able to ask that question at all levels: mm-hmm. leadership, frontline, administrative, wherever it needs to be asked.
But back to the topic of tampering, because I think you do a better job of explaining this than I have in the past. Because I've struggled to see the connections. Okay, with a physical activity like dropping a marble from a funnel and it moves, and the over adjustment increases the variation. I've struggled to connect the dots on, well, how does that apply to business metrics? Does that overreaction waste time, or does the overreacting end up increasing variation? I'm trying to remember. Did you address? I thought I remember you addressing that either when we talked before or in your course. Am I?
It does both.
Yeah.
And they're related. I don't know if they're mutually exclusive. But anything that's important to a business can be measured usually, whether it's, the time it takes to provide a certain kind of treatment, or the cost of a treatment, or the effectiveness of a treatment, and then, all the equivalent things that happen in other businesses. But those can be measured. And anytime we look at data from those processes and we use the wrong analysis approach, and then we act on it, we are undoubtedly going to be tampering, which mathematically, experientially, every way you want to describe it, when you tamper, you make the process worse. So if it's important to you, the time it takes, let's go back to your A&E example from the UK. If the 4-hour, nobody's going to wait long, the waiting time for A&E, if that's a critical performance measure, if you as a manager or as a frontline worker say, okay, I'm going to look at data and I'm just going to assume that everything I see is a special cause. I'm just going to assume that every piece of data is right, and I'm going to start making adjustments. You will make the wait times longer. And
people distort the system, right?
Yeah, and that may distort it as wider, larger spread. The average may shift, but it's going to be worse in one or more ways. And it happens differently in each situation, but there's that type of behavior. People need to know that tampering always causes a worsening. Mm-hmm. There's a good example that I ran into in a when I'm working with a retail grocery store. They had the same kind of situation where it was the wait lines for checkout. And management saw that the wait times for checkout were increasing. And so they mandated to management, you need to lower those. And so the manager immediately went out and said, okay, I need to lower these. They created kiosks, checkout kiosks at different places. And wait times got longer. But they did something. And then as I came into the situation, we had to kind of pull everything back and say, okay, what really is going on here? We looked at the data and we saw that there was no special cause. It was a common cause. All those wait lines were just common cause. And so you actually had to do something different than something like reacting like a kiosk. So we ended up doing capacity increases at peak times. We found also that some people doing the checkout didn't know how to check out certain items for sale. And so there would be all of a sudden this dead stop in the line. Right. So adding some training so that every person doing checkout knew how to check out every item. And the lines disappeared and the kiosks were mothballed.
Yeah.
So that's another example. And we could go on literally for days talking about where when you jump to a conclusion, and whether you're using data or not, those lead to tampering. And when you use data correctly, the way we're talking about in your book and in the course I have, that the chance of that happening goes down immensely. And so you're not perfect, but the chance of making those tampering kind of mistakes that damage and harm and even are dangerous, it now starts to be reduced. That's one thing I'm trying to help improve. I mean, I don't want this to be just some knowledge that I or you have. Right. It's got to spread. It's got to be much more widely known.
So I want to hear your thoughts on how to address. So we'd say, okay, we've got solutions that we know are really helpful, and we know they're not that complicated to learn or understand. But they are a solution to this problem, whether you call it tampering or overreacting to noise. It's a problem that people don't realize is a problem. So it's hard, I think, to say, hey, I've got a solution. And people are like, well, I don't care because that doesn't solve a problem of mine, right? I mean, maybe this marketing 101, how to frame the scenario that draws people in to help recognize, oh, you're right, there is a problem. I have a need that can be filled by statistical methods, whether we call it SPC or control charts or process behavior charts.
Yeah, those all help. More knowledge about it and exposure. I think anybody that's been through any type of Six Sigma type training understands that need. They may not remember which chart to use, whether it's a P chart or a X bar and R chart, or what the D2 statistics for as a subgroup size of 2, but those are technicalities. But so that's one way to get there, is just expose people so much to the tools that they begin to realize it. But I think there has to be more. I think there has to be some way, and I think this is what really your question is outside of exposing people to 160 hours of black belt training, heaven forbid, what are some other ways to show people the need for this? I think Demings' funnel drop experiment is a quicker way than 160 hours of black belt training. Is it quick enough? Not always. I've never met a group of an audience that's harder to pin down than executives and leaders and owners. You really only do have, I mean, there's a reason why there's elevator pitches, because you literally only get about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
I've started to become much more blunt and much more not unprofessional. I try not to be unprofessional, not being rude.
Right.
But I say things like, hey, I just heard you talking about this marketing data. And I asked some pointed questions like, well, how do you know that's not just noise like the coin flip experiment?
Right.
And they go, well, it might be. Well, what are you going to do? And I I start to, every chance I get, I try to make leaders especially aware of the validity or the invalidity of the way they're using data. And I try to do it in a um, Socratic way where I'm asking questions and leading people to those answers. Um, I don't know, Mark. What are you finding works? What?
Um, the Demings Red Bead experiment, that experiential exercise, I've seen time and time and again be really eye-opening, where smart leaders start connecting the dots and recognizing that behavior with metrics that are far more meaningful than the number of red beads on a paddle.
Yeah.
One chief medical officer, in his reflections after doing the red bead experiment, said he was being blunt. I think all of our quality and patient safety metrics are red beads, meaning they're just fluctuating around an average over time. And you can pretend like you did something to make it better, and you can react when you think it's gotten worse. But you draw a control chart or process behavior chart, and you see nothing but noise in the metric. So that can be discouraging. That can be politically unpopular within an organization when people have hung their hat on improvements, quote unquote, that they've made. So, but then part of the challenge is how to get people to the table, right? So, like in that one health system in particular, there were a couple of them in a larger group. It was a workshop run, sponsored by the organization Catalysis. And one of the other executives, I think, like, two of the senior leaders from this one hospital system were in the class. So the one had the insight of, I think all of our safety and quality metrics are red beads. And then the other, had, the takeaway was, we need to get our entire executive team and our board to get this exact same experience.
Yeah.
And I talked to her probably every 6 to 12 months. It's been a couple of years now. Of it never makes the agenda.
Right.
She still thinks it's a good idea, but she can't get approval. The timing's not right. And that's discouraging to her, I think, even more so than it is to me.
Yeah, I agree. The people directly involved in it, it is disheartening. I think your listeners would be good to offer some suggestions as they look at this. There has to be a way. For too long, this kind of knowledge has been exclusive, and whether it was in the Six Sigma black belts that were doing it, or whether it's in SPC, that knowledge needs to get everywhere. And then, that's why we're talking. That's why you're writing. That's why I'm trying to teach. I think any way and method and shape to make it more understood and better known. I think it does come down to experience. That's why you've seen the red bead experiment work. That's why I often bring up the coin flipping example, because everybody's flipped a coin. It just underpins what's really going on, and then connecting that to, look what you're doing right now. You're not looking at data validly, or you're tampering, or how could you draw that? But I think there's one of the people, I think, that I don't know him. I'm just acquainted with his work, but Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the author of The Black Swan, Anti-Fragile, Fooled by Randomness. He's blunt. He shows the problems with, he calls it interventionism, and he talks about the problems in macroeconomics and in political policy and in financial markets. These exact same things happen. So I mean, if anybody wants to, we have. So I believe that people like that are starting to see, in a very profound way, the impact that the invalid conclusions from data are having. And so I think there's a growing movement around this. There's a growing awareness around it. But I think this is something that we should engage everybody that has any insight on it. I'm not at a loss, but I would love to have more to be able to offer.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, I appreciate what you are offering, and you're trying to influence people and educate people. So thank you for that, Craig. If as we wrap up, if people want to find you, to have, to answer some of your questions or have a conversation or to learn more about your online course and other offerings, how can people best find you online or reach out to you?
Well, if you're looking for my data course, just go to pluralsight.com and search their courses for Truth. The course name is Truth About Data. It'll come right up, right at the top of the list.
Yeah.
And they have a free trial period. It's a shorter course, about an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
It has the conceptual side and the philosophical side, but it also gets into creating your first process control charts, things like that. So I think it's a great start into it. So if you're trying to get a hold of that information, that's the best place. To get a hold of me, my LinkedIn page is a very good source. It kind of shows what I've done in the past, where I'm trying to go. Some of my cutting edge stuff, especially in the management consulting with owners and leaders, I do through my consulting company called Strategic Productivity, and a website by that same name, strategicproductivity.com. I think data is one of about 4 things that the typical MBA training conventions get wrong, about 180 degrees wrong.
Yeah.
It has to do with, which values do you prioritize, data, like we've talked about, the selection of which metrics to use. And then another one that is right at the heart of Lean and Six Sigma is how do you manage improvement, learning, and change. The idea of Kaizen has kind of gotten lost. It's become a large, discrete event.
Yeah.
And anything we can do to add organic, self-directed improvement can surpass what's done in a command and control setting. So take a look at strategicproductivity.com for some of those other things. That's where you can find out about me, but I'm glad to have this conversation with you. It's always fun to talk. We have a lot of good things to talk about, and hope to be here again.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk about the Kaizen thing, and that's a whole different episode, maybe.
Yeah.
Kaizen is not just events, right?
Not by any means.
Yeah. Well, I again thank our guest, Craig Gygi. If you're going to look for him on LinkedIn or you can go to the show notes, the webpage for this episode, or if you're going to search LinkedIn, it's Gygi.
Yep.
Gygi. So you should be able to find him real easily on LinkedIn. And Craig, I'm glad that we've gotten connected and we've been able to talk. And I really want to thank you for being here in the podcast. It's been really interesting conversation. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Mark. It's really fun. Good to have a talk.
Yeah, thanks.
You bet.